Well, a very warm welcome from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. It literally is a warm welcome because it's over 40 degrees outside. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person, but I hope that this virtual presentation stimulates some discussion and perhaps we can have some correspondence on the subject. My chosen topic is sources for a study of the history of school meals within a broader theme, namely education, health and poverty in South Wales during the interwar period. The research is associated with BERA's History Special Interest Group and the BERA Commission on Poverty and Policy Advocacy, which is looking at case studies on the history of education and poverty, particularly the provision of free school meals in different parts of the UK and beyond. As you can see from the slide, the topic of free school meals is a very current and relevant one. There are many newspaper articles covering such questions as who is eligible for free school meals, the nutritional quality of the food provided, and there are academic questions about the reliability of free school meals as a proxy or indicator of poverty. Hopefully this brief presentation will hint at the potential that history has in illuminating some of these current discussions. I've structured the talk around three areas. Firstly, I will talk about the previous studies, research gaps and questions. Secondly, I want to give a context, historically and geographically, to the South Wales coalfield, and in particular we're going to focus on the interwar years. And finally, I want to talk about the possible sources for our research project. The administrative and social history of free school meals has been reasonably well covered since Clark's brief but informative Social History of the School Meals Service first appeared in 1948. It is interesting that Clark writes about the school meal becoming a social institution. The school meal service was not simply about meeting children's physical needs, it was also about actually ensuring that they were introduced to wholesome food habits. The need for local studies is highlighted by John Welshman's article, which looks at the development of legislation between 1906 and 1945. Welshman asks historians to consider the schools, streets and houses locally to understand how central policy making was interpreted on the ground. The subject of school meals is one that attracts global interest. James Vernon, in his History of Hunger, looks at how parents have been seen in different ways, from once regarded as lazy and morally flawed to becoming victims of circumstances beyond their control. Meanwhile, Rutledge describes the origins and development of school lunch policies in more than 150 countries that affect nearly 370 million children. Among the research questions this project hopes to address include the reaction of the local education authorities to central policy making in relation to free school meals, and secondly, how children, families and teachers responded to the introduction of free school meals. This needs to be set within a broader history of the emotions to find out specifically what kind of feelings children experienced. The historical study of human emotions, such as shame, disgust, contentment and happiness, is a relatively recent development. It forms part of a wider social and cultural history, an academic interest in subjectivity. Essentially, there are two broad questions to consider. Are emotions the same today as they've always been, effectively universalism, or are they culturally specific and change over time, what social constructionists would argue? Research in the history of hungry children may well benefit from drawing upon insights from different disciplines. The American social psychiatrist Murray Bowen's concept of the family as an emotionally governed unit, I think, is relevant here. Family systems theory suggests that people seek the attention of others and react to each other's needs, expectations and feelings. Emotional interdependence evolved to protect the family unit and ensure that its basic needs of food, shelter, and safety were met. However, during the times of heightened anxiety, and there were certainly plenty of these during the interwar period, stress is placed on the family relationships and emotional connections. The theory runs that eventually one or more members of the family will feel overwhelmed, isolated, and essentially out of control. These are the ones who absorb the family unit's anxieties and are more prone to ill health or breakdown. In the case of the South Wales mining communities, the single figure who often absorbed much of the anxiety of the family was the mother, or the Welsh mam. This is very well illustrated if we try and personalise this and look at the experience of one mother. Buried in the National Archive papers, I came across a letter written by Mrs. Ilsley, who was the mother of 15 children in a small town called Argyde in Monmouthshire. Although slightly outside our period, the letter dates from 1940, it is useful in illuminating the emotions surrounding the issue of free school meals. Mrs. Ilsley actually wrote to Neville Chamberlain, then Prime Minister, in sheer desperation. She explained that her husband had served in the Boer War but had his leg amputated and became unemployed. She described him as a hard-working man who repaired the children's boots and kept the house in good state. 7 of her 15 children received free school meals, but not during the 8 days of the Easter holiday, which meant that Mrs. Ilsley had an extra 56 meals to cook. She was at breaking point, and the worry was simply too much for her to bear. There's no doubt, and I think, the economic hardship experienced by many coalfield working class families during the interwar years. The boom conditions of the South Wales coal industry on the eve of the First World War simply couldn't be sustained in the face of falling demand and inefficiencies, along with mechanisation. Miners' wages could not keep pace with the cost of living, and this had a detrimental impact on the conditions of housing, diet, and the health of the population. So by 1928, the South Wales coalfield had acquired the reputation of being a depressed or distressed area. Although unemployment rates varied considerably from one valley to the other, between 1921 and 1935, around 3 out of every 4 men were consistently unemployed. Now, the impact of 15 years of sustained unemployment and poverty was reflected in family health. Children in particular suffered from diphtheria, rickets and pneumonia, with 1 in 5 failing to reach their 5th birthday. And indeed, the medical consensus revealed in local medical health officer reports attributed many of these diseases to children's malnutrition. A case study exploring the history of free school meals during the interwar period would certainly contribute to the wider debate about the healthy or hungry 30s. The likes of Steve Thompson and Sue Brewley have both highlighted the very important role of the family and wider community in caring for children. So what previous studies have made clear is that in the South Wales valleys during the interwar period, we had a mixed economy of care in operation. In addition to families, we also had chapels and churches, local religious bodies such as the Quakers, and of course the local education authorities, all contributing to the provision of meals, boots, and other provisions for young children. In the final section of this presentation, I want to focus on a few of the key sources to inform our study. In terms of oral history, then we have a variety of possibilities to explore. The South Wales Miners' Library in Swansea holds a variety of transcribed memories of ex-miners, and many of these relate to the 1920s and 1930s. But we do know that there are comments about the soup kitchens, hunger marches, and the general strike of 1926. Drawing on oral history from another depressed area, Barrow in Lancashire, Roberts suggests that while most working class families regarded self-help as a supplement to state aid, the government saw self-help as an alternative to state benefit, hence the introduction of the means test in 1931. She argues that attitudes changed in the first half of the 20th century from the 1900s, when working class parents had little expectation of state help, aside from the dreaded Poor Law, to seeing welfare provision as a right by the end of the Second World War. In terms of archival sources, I'd like to briefly comment upon school records. Historians of education have long made extensive use of school logbooks to examine daily school life. Typically, the head teacher would comment upon children's education, attendance, health and appearance. The opening of school canteens are recorded in some of these diaries. In 1926, for example, the head teacher at Merdy School noted that separate vestries were used to provide boys and girls with 2 meals a day. under the Necessitous Children's Act during the present stoppage of the pits. The National Archives hosts a number of very important confidential reports and investigations relating to the condition of children in the South Wales valleys during the 1920s and 30s. These need to be examined very carefully because these are not simply official memorandum and accounts of the reports of inspectors, but they also contain snippets of newspaper articles, occasional letters from parents, debates and discussions between local authorities and civil servants. Some of these debates are on very fundamental matters, such as how was the authority to determine who was eligible for free school meals. The Board of Education was in favour very much of a medical model in which the medical officers would undertake the examination, whereas the local authorities, certainly in the case of Aberteifi, wanted to continue with an income scale. Images of school canteens and meals are a relatively scarce source. There are a few surviving, showing, for example, scenes of children eating attended to by their fathers, who in a former life were army cooks. Such a nurturing scene is far removed from the hard, conventionally masculine image of the Welsh miner. Local newspaper reports do in fact convey a warm, supportive domestic scene of children eating at well-arranged tables adorned with flowers, attended by male waiters and with men and women sharing domestic chores such as washing and cooking. Teachers were also active in the school feeding programme, which was provided 7 days a week and during the holidays in some authorities. Given that many teachers came from mining backgrounds themselves, this doesn't seem to have caused any resentment, although there was some reluctance reported among teachers to give up their summer holidays. Both the London and Welsh press carried pictures of soup kitchens throughout the 1926 and other industrial disputes. The reports of local medical health officers are an important source to understand trends in the development of children's health during the interwar period. Children were the only section of the population that officials systematically collected data. Unfortunately, of the 15 local education authorities in South Wales, only Rhondda and Barry School medical officers published children's height and weight measurements consistently through the interwar period. The reliability of such data is also limited because of inconsistencies in recording. The Ebbw figures, for example, are recorded to the nearest inch and pound, and so mask minor changes in average figures. As the medical health officer for Llanelli put it in 1935, it is well known that the standards adopted by medical officers may vary. Well, I hope this presentation has given you some food for thought, if you pardon the expression. I think there are many questions that we can pursue in our various case studies. I think from a Welsh perspective, I'm particularly interested in why there was such variation among the local education authorities in terms of implementing the legislation relating to free school meals. But of course, our overriding interest, I think, is to consider the recipients of free school meals and the kind of experiences that they went through. Finally, I wonder whether the history of free school meals is a story of achievement and success. I mean, on the one hand, undoubtedly many thousands of children, not only here in South Wales, but other parts of the UK, benefited from free school meals that may well have kept them from starvation. And yet, on the other hand, we have, in the Welsh context, 1 in 3 children still living in poverty and something like 14% still receiving free school meals. And that makes me think, in a sense, about whether enough has been done to address the kind of structural problems that lie behind food poverty today.